There is a line in the appendices of The Return of the King that most readers have passed through at some point and already forgotten. It sits in the tale of years, the dry chronological annals in Appendix B, buried between dozens of similar entries, filed in the margins of the war like a clerical timestamp. September 18th, Third Age 3018. Gandalf reaches Weathertop at dawn and is attacked by 5 Nazgul. That is all. No description of what happened, no account of the fight, no record of outcome beyond the implied fact that Gandalf survived, because the rest of the book continues to require him. Tolkien timestamps the encounter and moves forward, the way a general's diary moves forward through individual engagements without dwelling on each one. Most readers move forward with him. But stop. Stop right there, at that line, because this is not a minor skirmish in a secondary theater of the war. This is a meeting between 2 of the most ancient and formidable powers in all of Middle-earth, on the most strategically important hilltop between the Shire and Rivendell, at the single most critical moment in the history of the Third Age, the Lord of the Nazgul. The Maya clothed as an old man, carrying a fire that comes from somewhere older than the hills, at night, on a ruined watchtower. And Tolkien gives it exactly 1 sentence in the appendices and says nothing more. Why? This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. The encounter is confirmed. The appendices record it with the terseness they reserve for things Tolkien assumed the careful reader would pursue. Unfinished Tales, in the section called The Hunt for the Ring, reconstructs the parallel movements of the Nazgul and of Gandalf across the autumn of TA 3018, with extraordinary strategic precision. What the texts do not give us is what happened during the encounter itself. Gandalf at the Council of Elrond, who speaks for pages and pages about the history of the ring, about the failure of the White Council, about Saruman's betrayal, about the movements of the Nine, says almost nothing about Weathertop specifically. He says he was attacked. He says he drove the Nazgul off. He says he escaped at dawn and left signs on the hilltop for Frodo and Aragorn to read. He does not say what the Witch King told him. He does not say what passed between them in the dark. He does not say what he understood by the encounter. And the Witch King, who led the Nine in everything that mattered, who built Angmar and ruled it for 6 centuries, who destroyed the northern kingdom of the Dunedain with the patience of something that had long ago stopped measuring time in human units, also says nothing about Weathertop. There is no record in Mordor's ledger of what the Lord of the Nazgul encountered on that hill, which leaves us holding a question the books open and never close. Did the Witch King let Gandalf escape at Weathertop, or did Gandalf fight his way free? And does the difference between those 2 answers tell us everything about what each of them already knew? This is what we are going to follow tonight, not the Weathertop that the Fellowship witnessed, with its ruined stone ring and its night of black terror and Frodo's wound. The other Weathertop, the one that came before, the one no one witnessed, the one that may have shaped the entire logic of the war that followed it. But to understand that meeting, you have to understand who was meeting, not the figures in the Peter Jackson films, which gave us extraordinary images and a very compressed version of the truth. The figures, as Tolkien actually built them, from the ground of the legendarium up. The Witch King of Angmar is introduced in most people's experience of Tolkien as a black-armored shrieking terror, a source of the Black Breath, the thing that broke Frodo's shoulder and nearly killed Faramir in the retreat from Osgiliath. In the films, he is a weapon with a voice, a very effective weapon, given more texture in extended editions, but fundamentally an instrument of destruction, deployed by a greater force. What the lore gives us is something far more disturbing. In the Fellowship of the Ring, in the chapter called The Shadow of the Past, Gandalf tells Frodo about the Nine. He says they were once men, great kings and sorcerers, and warriors, the mightiest and most learned of their age. Sauron gave them rings of power, and the rings, which should have been gifts, were instead a kind of trap, more sophisticated than any simple deception. These were not traps for the unwary. These were traps for the extraordinary. They worked precisely because the person who walked into them was already reaching for the thing the trap offered. power over death, long life without the fading of age, knowledge of deep things that mortality would ordinarily close off. These were real gifts. Sauron made them real, because a false gift would have been rejected by minds sharp enough to be worth corrupting. The Nazgul chose. This is the thing that the movies flatten. They chose, knowing they were choosing, and the knowledge of what they were choosing made the choosing worse, not better, because choosing with full knowledge is not an excuse. It is the shape of the fall itself. They looked at what the rings offered, and they reached. And the reach, which seemed in the moment like an ascent, was the first step of a descent, so long and so gradual that none of them could name the exact moment. The descent became a point of no return. The Witch King was the greatest of the 9. Tolkien establishes this in multiple places across the legendarium, and the word Tolkien uses is not most powerful in the sense of raw force. He calls him the greatest of Sauron's servants, and the distinction is precise. To be the greatest of Sauron's servants, you must have been, before Sauron, the most worth serving. The ring of the most importance was given to the candidate of the most importance. Whatever this man was before the ring found him, he was extraordinary enough to be worth the sustained and sophisticated effort of the most accomplished corrupter in the history of the world. Think about what that means, held as a specific fact and not a generalization. To be the Witch King before the ring is to be, by Sauron's own implicit evaluation, the greatest mortal mind and will and gift of the second age of Middle-earth. The man who became the Shadow was, once, something that deserved a word stronger than remarkable, and the ring did not destroy that greatness entirely. It could not. An empty vessel is useless, even to a Dark Lord, especially to a Dark Lord who needs instruments of strategic complexity, rather than simple terror. In his letters, Tolkien describes the Nazgul as beings whose will is wholly bent to Sauron's purposes, but whose accumulated intelligence and specific gifts remain bound to that service, precisely because the gifts are what make them effective. The Witch King could not have ruled Angmar for 600 years, conducting a grinding multi-generational war against Arnor that eventually destroyed the entire northern Dúnedain kingdom, if the ring had reduced him to pure instinct. That kind of campaign, fought across human generations, requiring the patience to outlast successive lines of mortal kings and mortal armies, and the determination of peoples who kept replacing their dead with new defenders, requires a mind, a very old, very cold, very patient mind, but a mind. It requires the shadow of the greatness that was once there. Now, hold that alongside what Gandalf actually was. The wandering wizard with the fireworks and the fellowship with hobbits is the public face of something the legendarium reveals in careful stages. In the Silmarillion, and in the section of unfinished tales called the Istari, Tolkien discloses that Gandalf is Olorin. Olorin was one of the Maiar, the lesser Ainur who entered the world at the beginning and participated in its shaping under Ilúvatar's design. He served Manwë and Varda, the 2 highest of the Valar, and was described as the wisest and most compassionate of all the Maiar in their service. But Tolkien is careful about something that matters enormously. Olorin was not the most powerful of the Maiar in the straightforward sense of raw force. Other Maiar, including one who became a Balrog and others who fell in various ways across the long history, possessed more direct, destructive capability. What Olorin possessed was something different from power, and something rarer. He walked unseen among the elves in Valinor and put fair thoughts into their minds. Not commands, not compulsions, fair thoughts. Courage in hearts that had gone cold, hope in minds that were approaching despair. And the elves who received these thoughts did not know where they came from. They believed the courage was their own. Olorin gave it entirely and kept nothing for himself. This is the specific gift he brought from Valinor and carried across the sea into Middle-earth when the Valar sent him, not to overpower evil, but to inspire the strength to resist it. Not to win battles, but to make battle possible. Do not mistake that for weakness. The Olorin who moved unseen in Valinor, putting courage into elvish hearts, was doing so because the elves needed courage to face something genuinely terrible. He understood the shape of what was terrible with a directness that the elves and men of Middle-earth could not match, because he was present at the music, present when Morgoth's dissonance first entered it, present when the world was made and when the first shadow began to form at its edge. He knew evil with the specific knowledge of someone who had watched it grow from a wrong note in the original song of creation. He had not been wrong about very much in the long history of the world, and now both of them, the greatest ruins of a man's free choice and the wisest of Manwë's servants, were converging on the same ruin of a stone tower in the dark of September. Here is what Unfinished Tales gives us that the main text does not. The hunt for the ring, that meticulous reconstruction of the autumn of TA 3018, allows us to trace the parallel movements of the Nazgul and Gandalf with something close to a strategic map. The Witch King crossed the Grey Flood in early September. He entered the Shire from the east. He divided his forces to cover multiple approach lines toward Bag End, searching for something whose name he knew, but whose face he had not yet seen. He moved with a systematic thoroughness that tells you something essential about his mind at this precise moment in the hunt, and the essential thing it tells you is this: he was operating under restraint. Sauron's instruction, as it can be inferred from the Witch King's documented movements and from the strategic logic of the situation, was to recover the ring without triggering the premature consolidation of the Western powers. Do not make Gondor mobilize. Do not make Rohan march. Do not force Rivendell and Lorien and the remaining Dunedain outposts into coalition before the ring is secured. Move like shadows through the land. Move like rumors that people aren't quite sure they heard. The Nine have been hidden from the world for generations. Use that hiddenness. Find Baggins and bring the ring home before anyone understands that Sauron has sent his greatest servants to recover it. This is the Witch King in September of 3018, a commander of exceptional capability, operating under strategic constraint, executing a mission that required suppression of the full terror he embodied. He was hunting, he was not conquering, and the distinction mattered. And then there was Gandalf. Gandalf in that same period was operating in circumstances that the formal record almost understates. He had escaped from Orthanc, where Saruman had imprisoned him on Midsummer's Eve, in early September, borne away by Gwaihir the Eagle. He had flown south over the misty mountains to Rohan, acquired Shadowfax, and was riding north with the urgency of someone who knows the board has been moving while he was held off it. He needed to find Frodo. He needed to communicate with Aragorn, who was already moving. He needed to understand the current positions of the Nazgul with a precision he could only achieve by getting ahead of them. He was managing the fractures of a situation that had broken in every direction during his imprisonment. And he knew the Nine were moving. Gandalf always knew, because knowing was the specific practice he had developed over a very long life of watching and connecting the threads of things. He knew the Shire had been searched. He knew Frodo had left Bag End. He did not yet know where Frodo was. He was moving on inference, on the strategic pattern that had kept him accurate across the decades of the Third Age. Both of them were converging on Weathertop by the logic of the terrain. Amon Sul, the Hill of Wind, had once been the tallest of the signal tower chain that linked Elendil's northern kingdom in Arnor with the other strongholds of the Dunedain, and ultimately with the Palantir network that allowed the Dunedain and Gondor to communicate across vast distances. Its Palantir was one of the seven. The tower was ruined long before the War of the Ring. The stone collapsed and broken, the signal fires cold for over 1,000 years. But the height remained. The sightlines remained. The hill stood where it had always stood, at the intersection of roads and approaches, and anyone moving through the eastern Breelands toward Rivendell passed within view of its summit. Anyone trying to watch that corridor, to understand what was moving through it, to protect or intercept it, would use Amon Sul. Gandalf reached it first. Picture this: an aged wandering wizard in grey robes, climbing the ruined track toward Weathertop's summit in the dark before dawn, a gnarled wooden staff in hand, his breath visible in the cold September air. He moves deliberately rather than hastily, because deliberateness is the mark of someone who has thought far enough ahead to know that haste is usually wrong. The ruins at the top of the hill are substantial enough to shelter behind, high enough to take in a sweeping view of the surrounding land in every direction. He is doing several things at once in the way that a very experienced mind does several things at once, without losing the thread of any of them. He is leaving signs, elvish marks carved into the ancient stone that a specific ranger who carries the blood of Isildur will know how to read. He is studying the approach lines, and he is doing something more difficult to name, using whatever extended perception a Maya walking in a mortal body retains, feeling the shape of the night around him, and the shape of the night has something wrong in it. The Nazgul carry cold. Not merely the absence of warmth, but a cold that is a presence in itself, a cold that defines them as things of negation, beings shaped by what has been hollowed out rather than what has been built in. Animals flee from it. Birds fall silent before it arrives within sight. The wind itself seems to thin and draw back from their passage. Frodo will feel it at the ford of Bruinen, across hundreds of yards of open ground. Gandalf, who is not Frodo, who is not a hobbit of the Shire, who carries within his aged body the deep awareness of a Maya who walked in Valinor before the world was young, would have felt the cold approaching long before the Nazgul reached the base of the hill. He would have known they were coming, and they would have known he was there, because the Nazgul sense the rings in a way nothing else in Middle-earth can duplicate. They are bound to the one through their nine, and that binding is both a chain and a kind of terrible perception. They feel the presence of ring power, the way a compass feels north. Gandalf carries Narya. This is revealed in the appendices with the quiet directness that Tolkien reserves for things of great importance. Narya, the Ring of Fire, was given to Gandalf by Círdan the Shipwright when Gandalf first landed at the Grey Havens, and Círdan's brief speech about the gift is careful and purposeful. He says he had perceived that Gandalf was the greatest spirit sent by the Valar, that the task ahead would require the specific quality that Narya could sustain, the kindling of the hearts of others against despair and coldness, and that the ring was most fitting for the one whose work was to keep the free peoples from giving up. The three elven rings were hidden from Sauron throughout the Third Age, but the presence of a ring of power at the summit of Weathertop, held by a being of Olorin's nature, would have registered as something, a warmth against the advancing cold, a fire where the dark expected darkness. The five Nazgul moved up the slopes of Amon Sul, and Gandalf was ready for them. Now here is the part of the lore that demands the most careful attention, because it is precisely where the received understanding of the Weathertop encounter diverges most sharply from what the texts actually say and what they actually imply. Most people assume that Gandalf fought the Nazgul off in a straightforward sense, that the combination of his fire and his status as a Maya was sufficient to drive back 5 ring-wraiths, including the Lord of the Nazgul himself, and that the encounter was a Gandalf victory that the appendices simply underreported. This reading fits the general narrative logic of Tolkien's story, where Gandalf is on the side that eventually prevails, and it has the appeal of simplicity. But look at it more carefully. Look at who the Witch King is by this point in the Third Age, and what his capabilities are, and what Tolkien says about the relationship between the powers of the Istari and the powers of Sauron's chief servants. In his letters, Tolkien is precise about not overstating Gandalf's raw power in any simple tactical sense. The Istari were sent not to overpower the enemy by direct force, but to inspire and guide the free peoples of the West. Using the full depth of his Maya nature against 5 Nazgul in an all-out contest of power would have been, in some significant sense, a departure from the terms of his mission. Gandalf did not come to Middle-earth to win fights by raw force. He came to make the free peoples capable of winning the war, which is a different kind of task and requires a different quality of strength than brute force. And the Witch King, with 4 other Nazgul, even under the strategic constraints of the autumn hunt, represented something genuinely formidable. These were beings who had held kingdoms, who had broken armies across centuries. The Witch King had engineered the complete destruction of an entire Dunedain realm in the north, had captured Minas Ithil and transformed it into the sorcerous stronghold of Minas Morgul, had faced the last king of Gondor in a single combat that the appendices record with careful historical vagueness. He was not a creature that any other single being then alive on Middle-earth, including an Istari of Olorin's quality, could simply overpower without significant cost. So what actually happened on that hill? Here is what Tolkien confirms, and then one step into what the lore compels us to ask. Fire. When the Fellowship reaches Weathertop 16 days after September 18th, Aragorn reads the signs Gandalf left on the stonework. Signs in the Elvish mode. And fire. The marks of fire are the important thing, because the Nazgul fear fire in a way that is not merely tactical aversion. The fire of the Maiar, fire that carries the warmth of Valinor's light in a world that Sauron has worked to pull toward cold and darkness, hurts the Nazgul in a way that other weapons do not. It does not kill them, but it drives them back. It makes their approach agonizing in the specific way that cold and shadow find warmth and light agonizing, as a contradiction of their nature. Gandalf used fire at Weathertop, and the Nazgul withdrew. That much is confirmed. Now here is where the speculation begins, staying entirely within the logic of the lore. The Witch King in September of 3018 was under strategic constraints. The ring was not at Weathertop. Gandalf was at Weathertop, but Gandalf was not the ring, and the mission was the ring, committing fully to destroying or defeating Gandalf at significant cost, revealing the full capacity of the Nazgul in a prolonged engagement on a ruined hilltop in the northern wilderness, was not the mission. The mission was finding Baggins. The mission was the ring. Now ask the question that changes everything. What if the Witch King looked up at the fire and made a commander's decision? Not a coward's decision. Not a creature retreating from something it could not face. A commander's decision. The assessment of a strategic intelligence that has been conducting complex campaigns across generational timescales for centuries. This hill does not have the ring. This fight does not advance the objective. The ring is moving. Let the old man have his hill. Follow the ring. If that is what happened at Weathertop, then Gandalf did not defeat the Witch King. The Witch King chose to leave, and those two things, being defeated and choosing to leave, are so different in their implications that they change everything we understand about what followed. Because if the Witch King chose to leave, he left with something more operationally valuable than a victory at Weathertop would have been. He left with information. He left knowing that Gandalf was actively in the game, that an emissary of Valinor was trying to protect the ring-bearer, that the stakes of the hunt had elevated to the level where the Lord of the Nazgul and the wisest of Manwë's Maiar were occupying the same ruined hilltop at the same moment in the war. He left knowing that what he was facing was not merely the resistance of men and elves, which he had faced and overcome before, but something older and harder to calculate. And he left having briefly been in the presence of Narya, the Ring of Fire. The thing Círdan gave Gandalf because the world would need courage, and Gandalf was the most reliable transmitter of it. What does the Witch King carry with him after Weathertop? He carries that knowledge through the failure at the ford of Bruinen, where the flood Gandalf and Elrond arranged sweeps the Nazgul away from the ring-bearer at the last moment. He carries it through the long winter months while the Fellowship forms at Rivendell, and then marches south through the empty lands of Hollin, and then into the dark of Moria. He carries it through the disintegration of the Fellowship at Amon Hen, through the grinding wars in Rohan, through everything. He carries a specific knowledge of what Gandalf is, a knowledge gained not from report or inference, but from standing in his presence on a dark hill with fire above him, and making the decision that the strategic logic demanded. And then he carries it to the gates of Minas Tirith. Picture this. The great gate of the White City has been broken, not by ordinary siege engines, not by the tools of ordinary war, by Grond, the wolf's head, the battering ram of Mordor, which Tolkien describes as a thing of sorcery as much as iron, wrapped in terror, driven by mountain trolls, forged specifically for this moment of the war. The gate that Tolkien calls invulnerable to ordinary assault has given way. The city's first and most symbolic defense is gone, The army of Mordor is behind the Lord of the Nazgul, and before him lies the great street of Minas Tirith and the city's heart. And in the ruin of the gateway, in the broken space between the fallen doors, sitting on a horse that stands utterly still, is an old man in white, not grey, white, because this is not the Gandalf who stood at Weathertop 16 months ago. This is the Gandalf who went into the dark of Moria, after a Balrog, after a Maya of Morgoth's service, and came back from that darkness, carrying something he did not carry going in. Tolkien describes what he came back as with careful precision: the White Rider, the one whose authority Saruman, who had studied power his entire life, immediately recognized as exceeding his own, the one the Ents feel, the one the Rohirrim feel, without being able to name exactly why. The white is not merely a change of robe. It is a different expression of what Olorin actually is, at a depth that the grey mantle had deliberately kept muted. The Witch King, riding through the broken gate into the space before the city, encounters this and stops. There is a pause in the text that is easy to miss if you are reading quickly. A brief silence before any word is spoken. Two ancient powers in the ruin of a gateway that was never supposed to open to an enemy, and neither moves. This is the second meeting, and it is different from the first, because both of them are different. The Witch King is not under orders of restraint now. The mission is not to find the ring quietly. The mission now is the complete overthrow of Gondor, the shattering of the last great western stronghold, the opening of the road to the final ruin of the Free West. He is operating at full capacity, at the height of what Sauron has built him into across the centuries of his shadow service. And the white before him is not the grey who stood at Weathertop. It is something that the Witch King's ring sense tells him is different from anything he has encountered in all of the Third Age. And the Witch King says, "Old fool, do you not know death when you see it?" Most readers hear this as contempt, the monster's taunt before the hero is crushed. The darkness sneering down at the light. It fits the dramatic structure, and it fits what the films gave us. But think about who the Witch King is talking to. He is talking to a being he has already met, a being he has already tested, in the dark, on a hill, 16 months ago. He is not introducing himself to a stranger. He is returning to someone he assessed, at Weathertop, as worth leaving alive in favor of the greater mission. And now the greater mission has brought them back to the same axis of opposition. Old fool. It is an interesting thing to call a being you already know is not a fool. The Witch King, who was once the greatest mortal mind of the Second Age, who has spent centuries executing complex strategies across multiple kingdoms and theaters of war, who looked up at fire on Weathertop and made a sophisticated calculation about strategic priorities under operational constraint, does not actually believe Gandalf is a fool. He cannot. He has stood in his presence and felt what he is. So what is he saying when he says, "Old fool"? Perhaps he is saying, you are old enough to know better than to sit in a broken gate with nothing behind you. Perhaps he is saying, I know what you are and I know what I am, and this is the hour of Mordor's full power, and the thing that stayed my hand at Weathertop no longer applies here. Not tonight, not with the city broken and the army behind me. Perhaps he is saying, I recognize you, and I recognize that you recognize me, and I am telling you that this time I am not choosing to leave. And Gandalf says nothing back, because what Gandalf is doing at the gate of Minas Tirith is not what it appears to be from outside. It is not despair. It is not a last stand. It is not an old man who has run out of options, sitting in the most visible available place to die with dignity. It is something far more specific. He is holding a point on the map, for precisely as long as the map needs it held. He is being, in the ancient gift that Olorin brought from Valinor and never ceased to exercise, the courage that does not know it is being given. Not his own courage for his own sake. Courage as a transmission, aimed at the soldiers behind him who have not yet run, aimed at the city that can see him sitting unmoving in the ruin of what was supposed to be its invulnerable gate. He is buying time, and he knows what is coming that the Witch King cannot know. Here is where Glorfindel's prophecy enters the lore and rewrites the meaning of everything that happens at the gate. In Appendix A, In the section called The Realm of Gondor, Kings and Stewards, Tolkien records an ancient prophecy delivered by the elf lord Glorfindel after the fall of Angmar in TA 1975, when the Witch King was driven from his kingdom and fled. Glorfindel said, "Do not pursue him. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall." This prophecy was ancient by the time of the War of the Ring, and the Astari, who were sent from Valinor with deep knowledge of what Sauron's servants were and how they could be undone, would have known it. Gandalf would certainly have known it. Gandalf, sitting at the gate of Minas Tirith, was not sitting there because he thought he could destroy the Witch King. He was sitting there knowing, with the specificity that Glorfindel's prophecy provided, that the Witch King's end was not for him to give. Not because he lacked the power to contest the ground, whatever that power was at the level of Gandalf the White, but because the cosmological law that Tolkien embedded in the legendarium through that prophecy pointed the resolution somewhere else. It pointed to someone who was not a man and was not a wizard. And Gandalf knew, because Olorin always knew, because knowing the shape of how things were going to resolve before they resolved was the specific wisdom that Valinor had sent him to exercise, that the resolution was coming. Hold the gate. Do not let the line collapse. Keep the soldiers from running. Keep the city from giving in to the despair that the Witch King radiates like cold. Hold it until the thing that is coming arrives. And what was coming was not a plan. What was coming was grace. Éowyn on the Pelennor fields is not a strategic deployment. Tolkien does not give us a scene where Gandalf says to Theoden, "Send the woman in disguise to ride beside you, in case the Witch King needs someone who is not technically a man, to be the instrument of his downfall." Éowyn is there because she could not stand to be left behind. She is there because of love and grief and determination, because she had already lost much and was unwilling to lose more watching from behind a wall. She is there because Merry is there, and Merry is there because he could not stand to be left behind either. And together, the woman and the hobbit with the ancient blade from the Barrow Downs, a blade forged in the long wars of Arnor by Dunedain hands that had been fighting the Witch King for 6 centuries, arrive at the precise moment the convergence requires. The blade Merry carried was specific in a way that Tolkien elaborates carefully. It came from a barrow in which the Barrow Wights had placed treasures and weapons from the old kingdoms of the north, weapons made in the wars against Angmar, weapons made with the intention of striking at the Witch King himself if the opportunity arose. Tolkien says, in a note that many readers pass through without stopping, that the blade had been made to fulfill a specific doom against the Witch King. It weakened the protective spell that kept him beyond the reach of ordinary mortal harm. Not permanently and not completely, but enough. Enough for Éowyn's sword to find what it needed to find. And this was not calculation. No strategy produced this convergence. No plan brought the right people with the right weapons to the right place at the right moment. What brought them there was the specific quality that Olorin had always known was the one thing Sauron could not replicate or predict. Genuine love that did not ask for anything back, and the courage it produced in people who had not known they possessed it until the moment required it of them. This is what Gandalf knew when he sat on Shadowfax in the ruined gate. Not the specific mechanics of what was coming, but the shape of grace, which he had spent his entire existence learning to recognize and to protect the space for. He was protecting the space. He was holding the gate open until grace arrived through it. Now return to Weathertop one more time. Not to add new detail, but to look at the whole from the distance that the later events provide. Gandalf, standing on Weathertop with his fire in September of TA 318, is not only a tactical event. He is doing something that Olorin has always done, something that Valinor sent him specifically to do. He is being the courage in the dark. Not for any army, for the marks he is leaving on stone, for the thin thread of the plan that passes through this hill on its way to somewhere else. He is holding Weathertop not because the ring is there, but because the hill is a point where the war passes through, and he will not leave it undefended, even if what he leaves behind is only fire marks in ancient rock and elvish signs that one man in the whole world will know how to read. And the Witch King looked up at that fire and felt the presence of Narya, and felt the shape of the being holding it, and made his calculation. This is not the ground on which this war is decided. The ring is moving. Follow the ring. He was right. By every measure he had available to him, he was right. The ring was moving. Weathertop was a distraction from the mission. The calculation was correct. What the Witch King could not have known, what his centuries of shadow wisdom had no category for, was that the old man on the hill was not a complication in the larger pattern. He was the pattern itself. Gandalf at Weathertop, Gandalf at Moria, Gandalf at Theoden's court, Gandalf's letter to Frodo, Gandalf's push against Dol Guldur at the precise moment that freed Thorin's quest and set the chain of events moving that eventually led to Bilbo, and then Frodo, and then the ring's end in the fire it came from. Every thread of the war ran through the old man with the staff. The Witch King left the hill because the hill did not look like where the war was decided. The hill was where the war was held together, and Gandalf let the Witch King leave, because the Witch King's ending was not his to give, and he already knew it. This is the reckoning at Weathertop that nobody witnessed. Not quite a fight, and not quite a negotiation, because there is no standing to negotiate between a servant of the shadow and a servant of the light. But something between those two things, a recognition, an inventory of forces, two ancient intelligences looking at each other across a fire in the dark, and arriving at the same conclusion from opposite sides. The ring is not here. This is not where it ends. The fire burned. The runes were carved. The night finished itself. Gandalf rode east toward Rivendell. The Witch King turned south and west toward the Trail of Baggins, toward the war that would eventually bring him to Pelennor and to Merry's blade and Éowyn's spear, and the moment the prophecy was fulfilled. And neither of them spoke of it afterward. Because what would you say? How do you put into words a meeting between two beings of that depth and that history on a dark hill that most people have never stopped to read about, in an appendix that most people have never opened, in the last pages of a book that most people think they have already finished? You leave a single line, filed between other timestamps of war, and you trust that someone, somewhere, at some point in the long future of the world, will stop and read it carefully enough to feel what it contains. September 18th, Third Age 3018. Gandalf reaches Weathertop at dawn and is attacked by 5 Nazgul. Did the Witch King let him escape, or did Gandalf fight his way free? The lore holds the question open. And I find that questions the legendarium refuses to close are often the ones that draw the deepest readers to the surface. If you have a theory about what was said on that hill, not the Fellowship's Weathertop, but the other one, drop it below. The conversation matters. And if you want to keep following the threads the appendices leave open, the lines Tolkien filed away, as though he did not know they would hook someone for the rest of their life, follow the channel. There is more in the legendarium than one reading can hold. There always is.